John Woo established himself as a top director out of Hong Kong, delivering spectacular action and visceral violence. But then he showed he could do more by making a film that was as equally philosophical and poetic as it was ferocious. Hello, I'm Peter Garrett, and this is the Criterion Chronicle. Welcome to the Criterion Chronicle. I'm your host, Peter Garrett. The Criterion Chronicle is the chronological journey through the Criterion Collection, starting from DVD Spine number 1. Now, the next film on our cinematic quest takes us to Hong Kong with Criterion Spine number 8, John Woo's 1989 action neo-noir classic, The Killer. Now, The Killer tells the story of a lone hitman named John for English audiences, or Ajong in Hong Kong, or in Cantonese, but I'll refer to him as John throughout the episode. So it focuses on the story of a lone hitman named John who accidentally blinds a lounge singer named Jenny during a job and attempts to atone for that act whilst simultaneously being hunted by a crime lord and police inspector. Hong Kong cinema has a truly fascinating history. So the Hong Kong film industry was established separately from mainland China's, which was centered in Shanghai, which makes sense because at the time, Hong Kong and when it emerged was still ran by the British Empire, so they had more, It's not surprising that it was created separately from mainland China. But for most of the early 20th century, Hong Kong's film industry actually found itself in Shanghai's shadow until the late 1940s. Because it wasn't until after the communists gained power in mainland China and nationalized the film industry where Hong Kong really got its major boost. So, because of what happened after the communists took power, many Chinese filmmakers relocated to Hong Kong after 1949, which established this kind of massive creative well to draw from, essentially. Because again, they knew that they would have more artistic freedom and viability in Hong Kong than had they stayed in mainland China. So, while the Hong Kong film industry produced many genres of films, by the 1970s, probably the most popular and commercial films were the martial arts or the wuxia films. So those are the films where they're usually period films with characters flying in the air. The wire stunt work was really popular. So you had the films of King Hu, like Dragon Inn or A Touch of Zen. So, and of course, in the 70s, the biggest star of that time was undoubtedly Bruce Lee, with such films like The Big Boss, Fists of Fury, and Way of the Dragon. So, and Lee's massive success also served as the gateway for the rest of the world to become familiar and introduced pretty much to Hong Kong cinema at that time. So that I think Lee and the martial arts films are really what kind of introduced the world at large to Hong Kong cinema, primarily by the 70s. But then it was by the end of the decade that another star emerged who would soon become, an enormous global icon, and that was Jackie Chan. So, and what's interesting is as Chan was becoming more popular, a new filmmakers were beginning to blossom as well and come out. that would have a profound effect on the Hong Kong film industry leading into the 1980s. So, because the 1980s, truly became a golden era for Hong Kong cinema. So, because before this time, by the late 70s, films had gotten more, they'd gotten more formulaic and safe for audiences. It was dominated by a studio system. There were a couple of studio systems there, one being like the Shaw Brothers, and they focused more, focusing more on, say stunt work and spectacle than say character depth and strong storytelling. So, and the thing was, that was actually still really popular. That was selling. That was doing really well in Hong Kong at the time. So, but from a creative standpoint, it hit a point where the directors and the creatives weren't happy. So it was similar to how Hollywood was, I feel like, in the mid 60s, right before the new Hollywood directors came about and changed the industry into the 1970s. So, because again, with it, when the rating system happened in Hollywood, that's when Hollywood was able to actually start to do a lot more things that they couldn't do before because of the Hays Code. But again, but also because of the way that by the mid to late 60s, the big epics and the big profitable genres and films that were kind of losing their popularity. So and I want to say the new Hollywood directors really kind of infused this new blood and new creative these new creative juices into Hollywood in a very revitalizing way. But again, the Hong Kong film industry's evolution wasn't precipitated by audience apathy or boredom. But it was by creative restlessness and generational change by the filmmakers themselves. So, and by the 1980s, the historical kind of period focused and rural films of the previous decade that were supplanted with, these grittier urban stories that featured contemporary settings and themes. So examples of this would be films like Sui Hark's Dangerous Encounters of the First Kind, Anne Hui's Boat People, and Patrick Tam's Nomad of the Hong Kong New Wave, which focused on social issues, class struggles, a stronger sense of realism and, real world anxieties and tensions of the time. So, and it was films like these that really carved out a strong identity for the contemporary Hong Kong audience. So that laid the groundwork, but it was in the mid 80s when the crime, triad, heroic bloodshed films started coming out that Hong Kong cinema, I think, truly reached its zenith, peaking in the late 80s and early 90s. So, and this is where John Woo came into the picture. But along with John Woo, you had other prominent filmmakers of these genre films, which included the aforementioned Sui Hark, Ringo Lam, Sammo Hung, and Johnny To. So, and this group pioneered multiple techniques that were seen as revolutionary. So, like the stylized action, fluid editing, the more highly emotional stakes in the action, in the violence, that Western films just really weren't doing at the time. So, and it was these filmmakers that ended up having incredibly strong influences on Western directors. So directors like Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, Luc Besson, and Chad Stahelski. So I hope I said that right. If I didn't say that right, please correct me. But so, and at this point, Hong Kong, and what I thought, I didn't even know this. This was kind of crazy to me. Which at this point, Hong Kong had become the third largest film industry in the world after Hollywood and after Bollywood. So, again, I had no idea that the Hong Kong film industry at that time had gotten so large. So, Now, and I would say that there was a core subgenre that had emerged from this era that defined many works of that time. Neo-noir is the modern incarnation of the classic Hollywood genre film noir that had its peak in the 1940s and 1950s. So, but neo-noir is looked at as an evolution of the genre, not just kind of not just a modern interpretation. So the main differences are how neo-noir took the kind of was able it modified and subverted a lot of the established tropes of classic film noir. So one such difference is how in traditional film noir was set exclusively in American cities because it was a Hollywood creation. So cities like Los Angeles, New York, or San Francisco, which were probably the most prominent. Whereas, neo-noir cinema proliferated across the globe, including in Hong Kong. So, and now I would say that The Killer is one of the pinnacle films that represents Hong Kong neo-noir, along with Ringo Lam's City on Fire, as well as Wu's other films, A Better Tomorrow, and his masterpiece, Hard Boiled. So, and Hong Kong neo-noir stands out to me amongst neo-noir films in other countries in a way because it blended the regular neo-noir elements with those native with film elements native to Hong Kong. So, it fused the dark and gritty narrative elements of neo-noir with the signature action spectacle of the time. Because Hong Kong cinema was obviously had always been, action cinema was their thing. So, but again, going from the martial arts films that they were really, really well known for, and kind of upgrading it and making it more brutal with the kind of contemporary action films that came after. So, but also, another way that it differed, that Hong Kong neo-noir was set itself apart was it featured these stronger emotional relationships and themes than typical neo-noir films. So, but I'll cover those two things in later segments because there's a lot to cover. So, but the film, even though it does do its own thing, the film does use traditional neo-noir tropes, beautifully as well. So I'd say the first thing is, the three main characters are all strong archetypes for the neo-noir genre. So you have Chow Yun-fat's character, John, is the quintessential neo-noir protagonist. So he's a hitman, but, so meaning that he's more, but he has a strict, code of honor that he lives by. So that makes him, he's morally gray. He kills people, but he doesn't do it. But again, he does have a warped sense of right and wrong that I guess a professional killer could have. So, and then you have Jenny, who is the lead female character. She's played by Sally Ye. And now, granted, in most neo-noir or noir films, the lead female would usually be a femme fatale. But in this, Jenny is kind of a pure damsel in distress, essentially. So she's very innocent and she's the tragic love interest. So, and then, she's pulled unwittingly into the story, but she ultimately serves as the primary motivation for John's character. So, and then finally, there's Danny Lee's Inspector Li Ying. So, who is the mirror image to John's protagonist character. He starts as an antagonist, but then he slowly begins to bond with John, and that which creates one of the core relationship dynamics in the film. So which again I'll talk about in a later section in definitely more detail. So, but what I'm going to do, what I want to do in this section mainly is focus on the visual aspects of the film, because one of the most prominent neo-noir aspects to this film is the way that Hong Kong serves as the perfect neon-soaked urban setting for the story. So, I mean, that's that, it's an incredible, it's an incredible location. So, and again, it was shot on location in Hong Kong. So, multiple scenes utilize the city's towering density to increase what I think is the sense of dread and oppressiveness, because that's something that noir films tended to do a lot, is the city, like whether it was New York, especially because of all the skyscrapers, you feel like this kind of claustrophobia that adds to the almost hopelessness of the situation. So, and there's I think there's a good many beautiful illustrations of scenes like this. So there's a scene when Jenny is alone on the street after leaving the nightclub, and John is watching her, and she's attacked by two assailants. So beautiful street shot right there. You have many shots leading up to and during Lee's introduction during his undercover mission meeting with some, I want to say they're like arms dealers, or they're criminals, but they don't say what it is. But we see him driving with his partner through the city streets, and going up to where this rendezvous, this meeting is happening, and then it's followed by a shootout. And then especially after the shootout, Lee ends up chasing one of the suspects through the streets, and we see it's a beautifully shot sequence where he's running around the city streets at night. So that's probably one of my favorite shots in the entire film, because I love that kind of noirish look. So and one of the a core noir staple from the beginning of the genre, so all the way back to its original film noir, is its use of high contrast lighting, which is often referred to as chiaroscuro lighting. So sorry if I didn't say that correctly, but I'm hoping I did. I probably should have looked it up. I meant to, but yeah, it's chiaroscuro lighting, as well as the presence of dramatic shadows. So creates a lot of contrast on the faces, and often because I think they use a lot of natural, like they try to establish light sources from windows and lights to be more again to have a stronger effect, as opposed to everything being well lit everywhere. And so, but also, light sources tend to appear brighter with kind of this noticeable soft glow to them. So examples of this would be the lights in Jenny's apartment, the lights on the basketball court when we first meet Inspector Lee, the street lights and the headlamps on the cars as they're driving to the meeting, the windows in the hospital when later on when Lee's partner Chang dies. So again, and I feel like having that creates this really strong visual language that I think is really incredible. So and then the film utilizes also strong some really strong colors, especially the color blue in several scenes. So for instance, after the first shootout, when John is in the church and they're taking bullets out of his like shoulder, we see the lightning strike outside, but then it flashes kind of the strong neon blue against like half of his face, and which I think is a really cool shot. And then you have other great shots like outside of Sydney's house, and when Sydney is talking to Wong regarding what to do about John. And then after John leaves his apartment and he drives out to the sea, so there's a great shot where he's just standing by the water, and it's just this gorgeous blue, this completely blue visual. So but then there are also scenes with other colors that are very intense and neon infused visuals. So, as John is in the nightclub listening to Jenny, or when Lee is also later on at the club talking to Jenny and John is watching both of them. So, and the shootout in John's apartment, along with, so it's, again, the visual palette of this film, I think is wonderful. So, and along with the lighting and the shadow, the killer becomes, even more visually pronounced by using elements like rain and smoke to enhance the atmosphere of specific scenes. So, because the thing is, rain and wet streets tend to create more a more dramatic and vibrant image on the screen. Oftentimes because wet streets tend to reflect, say, buildings or images, and so that creates just again a more beautiful image. And so the examples of this would be when John and Jenny are walking away after meeting in the street. So and I think and it's like and you see this in so many other films of noir, is rain always plays this kind of I want to say it because it adds to the atmosphere of it, because rain also we think of it emotionally as this more kind of melancholic emotion or weather pattern, as it were. So in films like Blade Runner or Seven, where it's raining almost the entire time, like that adds, I think, to the more, again, the more negative tone of the story. So, but it's something that I think also really adds to the tone and somber nature of the killer is the score, which is by Lowell Lowe. So unfortunately, I can't play a sample of it because the copyright. But when you watch the film, try to listen to the music, because it's got these recurring haunting themes, and I think that you would see how much it really enhances the film's mood. So and then I think that the final strong stylistic aspect to the killer is the way it uses the juxtaposition of violence with settings or imagery that typically is associated with peace and safety and harmony. So, which is another thing that was a hallmark to Hong Kong neo-noir and action films, especially of Wu films, because he really wanted to juxtapose these visuals of these positive visuals with these negative actions, essentially. So, and the film does this mainly by using a church as the bookends for the film. So John Woo is a Christian. I think he's a Catholic. I know for sure he's Christian, but I learned he's Catholic. I'm hoping, if I'm not correct, then you can correct me, but I know he's for sure a Christian. And so he features which is why I think he features a church so prominently in the story, and it serves many purposes. So, we see the church in the very beginning when we're introduced to John during the opening credits. But the setting of the church is also used as a meeting place for John to meet with Sidney to get his next assignment, which is so we see him open, the briefcase that he's given, which has guns and the materials he'll need for his next job. So it's already clashing the religion with the violence from the opening scene. So, and then, it's funny because it becomes the location of the final confrontation when John and Lee team up to fight against the main villain, Wong, and his men. So, and then this is also the main reason John Woo frequently uses doves in his films, because as doves represent, purity and innocence, because they're usually pure white and they seem untouched and clean. And so, and it's funny because, anybody who's seen a John Woo film, for the most part, even in his American films as well, doves will pop up in a lot of different places. So, they pop up in Face Off, they pop up in Mission Impossible 2, they pop up in his first American film, Hard Target. So, and I'm sure people might have been wondering, like, what is this guy's deal with doves? Why does he have doves everywhere? And I'll be honest, I was one of those people. I never quite understood the dove metaphor, or why doves were present, because he doesn't use other birds in his films. It's primarily doves. And then when I learned what the significance and the meaning behind the dove, using doves were, I was like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So hey, there is a method to John Woo's madness, as it were. So, but I thought that was really cool. That is something that that I learned about. So, and the doves are mainly seen in the church scenes. So we don't see them anywhere else. But then also throughout the film, because there are other examples of using these pleasant or beautiful, positive environments as a backdrop for these very violent scenes. So the first major action scene is in the nightclub, which exemplifies this, because as Jenny is singing, she's singing very beautifully. It creates this very strong contrast to John's killing spree once the song ends. So the song ends, and then basically the shootout begins. And then another example would be when John and Lee have their first standoff in the hospital. So obviously a hospital is meant to be, again, a place of safety and where you go when you're in trouble. And then, you have this really tense, standoff between John and Lee. And then also when Lee confronts John in Jenny's apartment later. So again, being able to use that juxtaposition, I think, really adds more dramatic weight to the scenes. I think The Killer is just a very visually sumptuous film. And I think the reason the story resonates so strongly is due to the fact that John has a motivation that supersedes all others. One of the main reasons that Hong Kong neo-noir films are often referred to as heroic bloodshed films is because the characters have this inherent sense of honor that tends to transcend everything else. So it's one of the ways that Hong Kong neo-noir films don't descend into basically complete nihilism. So the relationship between John and Jenny is really the engine of the entire film. So, and The Killer is actually unique in a way that I think it's Woo's only film from that time that heavily featured a romantic storyline. So, because most of his films prior to that, most of his films focused on, kind of the relationship between men and in the sense of like brotherhood, the brotherhood between them. And it typically kind of sidelined romantic subplots. So, and I think it's so because it's John's sense of strong sense of honor and duty to what is right that drives the story. So, because, when he accidentally blinds Jenny during the opening hit at the nightclub, John takes it upon himself to protect and take care of her as a way to atone for his actions. So, throughout the film, John goes out of his way to protect Jenny. When he initially saves her from being attacked on the street, when Lee tracks him down at Jenny. So when Lee tracks him down at Jenny's apartment, he pretends that everything is fine because she can't see. So even though they're pointing guns at each other, John and Lee also gets involved. They pretend to know each other as if they're old friends. So they say they actually come up with these on the spot. They come up with these nicknames for each other, Butthead and Numbnuts, to show that we're actually friends. To protect Jenny, so that she doesn't know what's really going on. And then also, when John brings Jenny to the seaside house, that's his way of trying to protect her. And it's because I think John believes that Jenny is his path to absolution for living a violent life, because the job that he takes leading up to the last job he takes, he says, this is my last job, which is why he asks for, a much higher sum of money, because he wants to use that money to get an eye operation that would give Jenny her sight back. So, but he also just wants to be finished with doing this. So they don't quite say that the idea being is that John and Jenny will end up together and with each other, but I think it's pretty heavily implied that that's what it's leaning towards. So, and the thing is before the final church shootout, John even says that if he dies, for his corneas to be given to Jenny, believing that will be the first decent thing that he's ever done. So the relationship between John and Jenny is really, an incredibly strong and probably the most important. It's probably the most important relationship in the film. But then the second one most important is his relationship with Inspector Lee, because brotherhood is probably John Woo's most common theme across many of his films. So because in many of his films, the main hero, or in this case, the protagonist, just lead character, will often have a strong connection to the main villain or the antagonist. So, a more, an American example of this would probably be Michael Mann's Heat, with the relationship between Al Pacino's Vincent Hanna and Robert De Niro's Neil McCauley. So, which is perfectly exemplified in the coffee shop scene when they're talking to each other. So, but John Woo does this way, he creates these bonds in much stronger ways and develops them through the film. They don't just have maybe one or two scenes together where they just kind of nod and say, yeah, man, I get you. We're on the same wavelength. No, he actually shows a much stronger, at least in The Killer he does, between these friendships form between supposed enemies. So, and in The Killer, it's that relationship between John and Inspector Lee, and it's John. And it's John's sense of honor that initially leads, or that leaves an impression on Lee that leads to their beginning friendship and bond eventually. So there's a scene on the beach where John is double crossed, and there's a shootout, and unfortunately there's a little girl who is shot. And John takes it upon himself to rescue her and rush her to the hospital to save her life. And that's something that proves to Lee that John, that first kind of plants the seed that John isn't some cold-hearted killer. So, because he's driving with Chang to the hospital, and Lee even says, he's not going to let the little girl die. So, and it's after their first confrontation in the hospital that Lee admits there's something kind of heroic about John, and that he doesn't look like he's a killer. So, uh, and then, Lee represents the other side of the law, but he shares more in common with John than he realizes. Because like John, Lee has a sense of honor as well, but he finds himself at odds with his job a lot of the time. So often he's put in situations that creates internal conflict within him. So after the chase through the streets on the tram, he gets onto a bus and he shoots a suspect on the bus, but one of the bystanders there ends up dying of a heart attack, which leads to him being reprimanded by his boss. But he defends himself by saying what he did was necessary. The guy was dangerous and he had a hostage and he did what he thought was the right thing to do, even though there was unfortunate collateral damage as a result of his actions. So, and then also he's tasked with protecting a known criminal at the Dragon Boat Festival. So, which again makes he's thinking like, we should be arresting this guy. We shouldn't be protecting him. But again, because of the nature of what he's doing and his job, he's kind of stuck. He has to do his job and he has to do what his boss says, even though it goes against his principles. So, and then, he's the fact that, his boss berates him after he doesn't arrest John. And I think that's because by this point, Lee is starting to see the commonalities between him and John, and he doesn't quite see John as the evil criminal that he normally would take someone in John's position to be. So I think it's at this point, that scene is, I think, where the crack starts to form in the foundation of Lee's character in terms of being this straight-laced, or at least more straight-laced police officer, which gets its ultimate payoff at the very end, which I'll talk about a little later. So, but I think it's when Lee essentially doesn't bring John in, and it's not really by choice. It's John is able to get away on his own, but Lee doesn't, because after John leaves the hospital, he takes the keys from Lee's car. But I still think that Lee isn't quite so upset, at least maybe subconsciously, that he wasn't able to bring John in even a little bit. Maybe not much, but it's my interpretation. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Lee is at this point still fully in on bringing John in. But this is where I like to believe in the movie is where Lee's character starts to diverge and start its journey to being closer to John. Because as Lee is investigating John, he begins to emulate him, showing their kind of growing connection. So this is when Lee visits Jenny's club to listen to her sing. When especially this becomes really prominent when Lee is in John's apartment after the shootout there, visualizing the nature of the shootout. So there's shots that actually replicate exactly, they're done exactly in the same way as like when John pushes back in the chair and starts the shootout, Lee does the exact same thing and the camera moves and it does it in the exact same way. So I think that's Woo's way of showing the parallels and the coming together of those two characters thematically. So, and I think in a way, Lee probably envies John because John has a freedom that Lee doesn't really have, because John can punish those that deserve harsh justice in a way that Lee can't due to the fact that he's a police officer. So, and, because at one point, John even admits that, to further kind of illustrate the eventual bonding of these two, John admits that he and he kind of laughs about it, is that the only person to understand him is a cop. So, and it's this kind, and I feel like that's kind of the moment in the movie where the two of them are finally now like, they understand each other and they recognize each other. And the final battle in the church is the climax moment for their bond. So, where Lee officially joins John to fight off Wong's men. So, because at that point, both men have lost someone to Wong's ruthlessness. So, which, you have John's, best friend Sydney and Lee's partner Chang. So, and I think it's pretty much it's Lee's ultimate act of killing Wong that serves as his baptism by fire, as it were, because he guns down, Wong as he's surrendering to the police, and he does this knowing he's probably going to be arrested and at least lose his job, but his sense of honor and justice towards, especially towards Chang, and then now to John, is just too strong to ignore. So I think that, and so that's something, and that's what I really think the film does so well, is because, again, it creates this great progression of their relationship where it feels like it builds organically and naturally. So by the time that Lee does team up with John at the end, it feels earned. It doesn't feel rushed. It doesn't feel out of nowhere, like, why this doesn't make sense that all of a sudden Lee would just switch and team up with a guy that he's been investigating or hunting, as it were. So no, it gives enough time for the relationship to breathe and develop. And so what I think is, what I really like is how in the beginning, again, when they first kind of establish that fictional relationship to each other, where they call it, where they pretend that they're old friends with each other, and they use the nicknames, that by the end of the film, the friendship has actually become real. So, like, in the final battle sequence in the church, they actually start calling each other butthead and numbnuts in a kind of in a more serious way, as they're like throwing each other guns, and they're protecting each other, and they're killing the bad guys, or the force of Wong's men coming in. So so I just think that and again, and that's the thing, when you rewatch the film, when you pick up on those subtle details earlier, and then you're like, oh, here, the great payoffs later, and you get to see and see how the relationships develop, and you feel like, oh yeah, that makes, that's very, to me, that's very satisfying when you watch film, when you watch films. So, and then the final relationship that we get to see involves John and his mentor, / best friend, Sydney, because Sydney is the one who gives John his assignments. As well as being an ex-hitman himself, as well as being also in the employ of the main villain, Wong. And that actually means that this is probably the most complex relationship in the film, and where the sense of honor, I think, hits the hardest for the characters. Because Sydney goes back and forth from being an ally to John to being kind of an enemy, and then finally back to an ally. So, because when Sydney goes to pay John for the Dragon Boat Festival job, Sydney attempts to double cross and kill John, but John is prepared for that, because Sydney picks up the gun, points it at him, but there are no bullets. And that leads to I think one of the strongest emotional beats of the film, because after John repels the siege in his apartment, he has the opportunity and the ability to kill Sydney, but he ultimately chooses not to, because it's signifying that even though Sydney was willing to kill him, I think he can't fully see Sydney as his enemy. So, because John says that he always saves his last bullet for himself or his enemy, which means that because he didn't use the last bullet on Sydney, he doesn't quite see Sydney as fully, fully against him, even though he did betray him at that point. So, but then it's Sydney's final act of repentance, where he escapes, where he gets John's money, that he was like that, I'm going to get this for you. He basically goes into Wang's, house, demands it, shoots up a bunch of his henchmen, and then holds Wang hostage to get the money from him. And then he ends up escaping to meet up with John at the church, which serves as, and he, unfortunately he's ultimately killed by Wang at the church. But again, he did so in this final act of redemption and loyalty to John. So again, so the relationships are very kind of, obviously they're on the verge of melodrama. I mean, I don't know if they would be considered full melodrama, but they are very, obviously the emotions are very heightened, very dramatic, and sometimes they can be over the top. But again, that's one of those core elements to Hong Kong neo-noir, is these much more heightened emotional stakes in the story and in the relationships, in the character. So now, and the thing is, now neo-noir is often defined by the fact that narratives can end up being incredibly fatalistic and bleak, where the endings give you a sense of hopelessness and this kind of, the world sucks vibe. So think of endings to like Roman Polanski's Chinatown, or the aforementioned David Fincher's Seven. But The Killer doesn't end, to me, on such a nihilistic or hopeless ending as, say, Seven does. But it still ends on a downer. So, it's not quite, it's not a happy ending, which is, not to say that it would have been better with one. I think that the ending works at the core of it. So, but I'd say, at the center of the film is an actor who became one of the biggest stars in Hong Kong. Now, Chow Yun-fat started acting in the 70s, mainly on soap operas and television dramas, becoming a well-known TV star. But then he began transitioning into film in the late 70s. But unfortunately, but he would go on to have a string of kind of unsuccessful films. And that actually led to studios thinking that he just wasn't bankable on the big screen. So, that kind of box office poison label that some actors can tend to get. So, but then he was cast in Woo's 1986 film, A Better Tomorrow, and all that changed because the film became a huge success and would begin a director-actor collaboration that I think is one of the greatest in cinema history. So, not quite on the level as, say, Kurosawa and Mifune, or some of the other, or like Scorsese and De Niro or DiCaprio, but Wu and Fat would end up making 5 films together. They would make A Better Tomorrow, the first sequel, A Better Tomorrow 2, The Killer, Once a Thief, and then finally Hard Boiled. So, but The Killer was actually the first film where Fat played the clear lead of the movie, as opposed to just a supporting or a co-lead role. So, because in the Better Tomorrow films, he was more kind of a supporting role in a more of an ensemble lead than just the main character. Whereas in The Killer, John is the de facto protagonist, no ifs, ands, or buts. And I think it was Fat's success with Wu that led to him becoming one of the biggest Hong Kong film stars, as well as garnering international recognition as well. So, and I think there's a debate on which film Chow Yun-fat gives the more complex and interesting performance, whether that's in The Killer or Hard Boiled. So I think that is a judgment call. I would say in the comments, put what film between those two you think Fat gives the better or the more complex performance. But I believe both films have their individual strengths and show the full range of Fat's acting ability. And to me, I think it's too difficult to choose which performance I prefer. I mean, because some days I would probably say The Killer, and then other days I would probably say Hard Boiled. But The Killer was the first big action film where I think Fat's character wasn't just the super cool action hero. Because what I think stands out in The Killer about Fat's performance is the amount of emotional levels that he has to play throughout the film. Because it's easy to kind of play this kind of cool-headed assassin the whole time that doesn't show a lot of emotion. But in this one, he goes. It runs a whole gamut of emotional range. So like in the beginning, he's able to be the calm, cool-blooded assassin. Although we already see something different about him, because when we're introduced to him in the church, Sidney asks him if he believes in God, but he says no. But he enjoys the tranquility of the church. So that means that, he enjoys, at least this is what I interpreted to mean, is that he enjoys kind of the peaceful nature of what a church is. And we also see that because John lives by a church, so we see him, when he's playing his harmonica, we see a great shot of him on his balcony playing a harmonica with a church, with a crucifix in the background, which is another, to me, a really strong evocative image in the film. So which also I think plays into the conflicting and complex nature of John's character. But another scene that I think also shows John's cool and calculating nature is the Wong assassination at the Dragon Boat Festival. So because he's very kind of in the zone, he's in his workflow, because he's on a boat in the water, he gets into position, he's in disguise, he's got sunglasses and a mustache, which is actually reminiscent of the opening to Face Off, when Nicolas Cage's character also has a rifle and has a mustache. But yeah, so like, he's on the boat, he raises the rifle, but then he hesitates for a moment because he realizes it's not quite the right time. So he's not prone to acting impulsively or spontaneously or too soon. He knows he has to wait for the right moment, which is when the drumming starts, so that the noise of the drumming will mask the sound of the gunshots. So, so again, that's just another great, I think a great example of, again, how he's really, really great at his job. So, and Fat is able to look like he seems in control of every scene he's in, which I think is a credit to his strong presence and his charisma as an actor. And, he's a character that that feels like he's one step ahead of everyone else. Which again is exemplified when when Sidney tries to turn the tables on him with the gun, and he basically has, he dumps the bullets onto the table, showing Sidney that, hey, I had a feeling this was going to happen. Or when there's a scene when the police try to capture him at the airport, and he's able to evade them by pretending to be a Japanese businessman. So, where he's again in another disguise, and he uses Sidney as a decoy to kind of take the police on a chase through the terminal. And then John is able to get away with Jenny. And actually, it's interesting because that sequence was originally written to be much larger. I learned that apparently Wu wanted that sequence to be where it takes place like throughout the entire airport, that he wanted the characters to run through the entire terminal, like all the way through it. But unfortunately, At the time, I think he couldn't get permission to be able to shoot because he shot at a real airport, so he couldn't get permission to shoot throughout the entire airport. He might not have had the money, or both. And so they just used it as a small section, and it still works. So, and then I think the shootout in John's apartment serves as a real turning point in the film, because up until then, John seems in control of everything around him. But it's once Sidney attempts to betray him, that's when we see his world begin to unravel. And I think it's after that the film starts to lean into these heavier dramatic scenes. So before that, it's more action oriented and kind of more, granted it's more about the John and Jenny story at that point, but it still hasn't gotten into the more emotional beats yet. But it's after the betrayal, and then as the film becomes, progresses, that the dramatic scenes get bigger and more prominent. So you have the scene where John and Sidney, after John's garage attack, and they're on the hilltop and they're overlooking the city, and they're arguing about their sense of friendship, or their friendship and their sense of honor, because John is saying how, you just kill me right now, because I would rather you kill me than to see you beg a man like Wong and get on your knees, because that's so demeaning, essentially. And it's something that is so dishonorable. But, Sidney is saying that for his friendship, he's willing to demean himself for John's sake, for John's money, because that's how much that friendship and his sense of honor towards John, and also that sense of I think repentance for his earlier going against John. So that's a really, really strong dramatic scene. And then I think the most dramatic moments happen at the end during the climactic church battle, which is when Wong kills, when Wong shoots Sidney. And then ultimately, even though he's dying, we see John is actually the one who, so I said earlier that Wong kills him, which he does, but because he does shoot him and he's probably mortally wounded, but it's the actual, so the final bullet is actually by John. So John, in this kind of act of honorable mercy, puts the gun up to Sidney's, chin and fires. And we see John crying, and this is really just strong. And it's at that moment where John's like, all right, time to go to work. And it cuts to him, a shot of him, like, because he's been shot at this, or he's got a wound on his arm, and he puts this, I think it's a tie that he ties around his arm, and he's just like, boom, and it's go time. So that creates the final, at least John's final, like, strong emotional push for the final action sequence. And then at the end of it, when John is, where the standoff between John, Lee, and Wong, where Wong is holding Jenny hostage, and they fire at each other, John is blinded by the gunfire, which serves as obviously a payoff and kind of bookend to Jenny's blinding in the beginning of the film. That John's, and maybe that's John's ultimate absolution, is that he blinded Jenny, and as his pay, and the payback that he gets essentially is or maybe his divine retribution is he's now blinded. And we see him desperately crawling on the ground, trying to find Jenny, and Jenny's on the ground trying to find him. That's what kind of makes one of the key elements to the downbeat ending is John just doesn't, they crawl to each other and they can't find each other. And originally, I guess they were supposed to, but I think Wu decided it would be better if they pass each other and they don't quite find each other. And I think, one key element to John's character is his ability to forgive those closest to him, because he's able to forgive Sidney for his betrayal. But he's also able to forgive Jenny for setting him up to be caught at the airport. But that's also, I think, because Jenny has kind of a crisis of conscience as well. She initially kind of goes along with it, but then she starts to warn, just saying out loud, John, they're here to capture you. You need to escape. You need to run. So she does kind of go back and help him. But I think even if she hadn't, I think that John still would have forgiven her anyway, because, she's this innocent woman, and I think she's being caught up in this extraordinary situation that she might not really know how to deal with, and with the police and everything like that. So I think that he might not have held her to a same standard of loyalty as he might have held Sydney to. And and I'd say another strong aspect of Fat's abilities as an actor in the film is his physical abilities. Because in many of the films, like The Killer, he would do a lot of his own stunts. He wouldn't do all of them, but he wasn't quite on the Jackie Chan level. But Fat, in The Killer, Fat is able to carry most of the major action set pieces beautifully, because he did his own stunt work. So, that's including when he's jumping. In many of the action sequences, he's jumping around, he's doing rolls on the ground, and other, physical moves while engaged in shooting, because a lot of the sequences he's firing, two guns at the same time. And I think the reason John Woo liked using him so much was due to his command of the screen. Because, Fat is the kind of actor that you are always drawn to whenever he's on, because whenever he's on screen, like every other kind of classic, film star, we just can't take our eyes off of him. Even if he doesn't say anything, sometimes you still feel his strength as a character. So, and because of his such a strong success, he did what a lot of, international actors did. Or try to do, which is, he tried his hands at Hollywood. So he made a couple of films in the late 90s that were meant to be kind of his breakout and introduction to Western audiences in Hollywood films. So that started with Antoine Fuqua's The Replacement Killers, which is a very John Woo-esque film. And actually, John Woo was one of the executive producers on that. And then that was followed the next year by James Foley's The Corruptor with Mark Wahlberg. But unfortunately, he never reached the same kind of action heights in Hollywood as he did with Woo. And what's interesting is because I think that Chow Yun-Fat's most successful film in the world ended up becoming Ang Lee's Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which was a Chinese film. But that, I think, became his, ironically, that became more famous around the world, especially in the United States, because I think it became, at the time, the highest grossing foreign film. It still might be the highest grossing foreign film of all time in the United States. So, his Hollywood career kind of got off to was cut off to a kind of a disappointing start, but it was Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon that ended up being his true breakout I think to Western audiences. So, because before that, the directors like Tarantino and they knew Chow Yun-Fat from Woo films. But that was more like kind of a cinephile, community knowledge, not a general knowledge that all audiences had. So, but I still think though that Woo's best that Fat's best collaborations were with Woo, and that's because I believe that Woo is one of the greatest action film directors of all time. So in the realm of Hong Kong action cinema of the late 80s and early 90s, John Woo became the most iconic and influential director to come out of that period. So, other directors like Ringo Lam were prolific as well, but Woo was actually the pioneer who created the blueprint for the heroic bloodshed genre, and the films that became so hugely successful and popular. It was his film A Better Tomorrow that hit like a meteor and changed Hong Kong cinema forever, because you had a lot of films after that, which off the top of my head I don't know, that basically kind of copied Woo, A Better Tomorrow, and just turned into the way that Die Hard influenced the action genre in the United States, or The Matrix influenced a lot of things later on, with their action. A Better Tomorrow was that for Hong Kong, because and he became what was known as the king of gun fu. So gun fu was the main action style he used, which was creating massive set pieces for gun battles that were choreographed and filmed in a way that was similar to martial arts films. Now, Woo says that his two greatest influences were Martin Scorsese and Jean-Pierre Melville. And the Melville influence is particularly strong in The Killer, because, as it took a lot of inspiration from Melville's film Le Samouraï, starring Alain Delon. So the action sequences in The Killer are all highly frenetic and beautiful at the same time, which is what makes Woo's style so memorable. So there are 5 main action sequences, or shootouts action sequences in the film. You have the nightclub, you have the beach, you have John's apartment, the seaside house, and then the church. So there are other smaller action sequences that are in the film, but they are less stylized and more traditional. So the tram chase in downtown Hong Kong, the boat chase after the Dragon Festival Wong hit, the parking lot attack on the younger Wong and his men by John, and the car chase with Lee's partner Chang. And now the opening nightclub shootout was taken from Le Samouraï, which features a very similar scene. So again, drawing another way that Woo was influenced by Melville. And what I think is just so incredible is that the action is a fascinating dichotomy because of its chaotic and controlled nature at the same time. We see multiple characters shooting continuously, yet we're never confused by what's going on. And to me, that is a sign of Woo's brilliance as a director, because the choreography of the scenes are extremely precise. One thing that Hollywood does now is, it fills action scenes with a lot of quick cutting, hyper editing techniques that can be extremely disorienting and confusing sometimes as a viewer, because we don't know really what's going on. We don't know how, also, the Bourne films, you had the shaky cam, which also made things a little harder to focus on. Whereas the gunfights in Woo films are, again, very easy to follow. We know the geometry of the scenes incredibly well. So, which again makes it easier to process them and enjoy them. So, but also the gunfights in Woo's films are incredibly brutal in a way that Hollywood films would rarely allow. So not unless they went to like an NC-17 rating or an X rating at the time in the 80s. So, because, like The Killer can be almost casual in how the gunfights start. So in the opening nightclub shootout, John just kind of quietly, knocks on the door. And when the guy answers it, he just starts shoots him right away before he dives into the room and just starts shooting everybody else. And then in John's apartment, when he slides back in his chair and he shoots the first intruder that tries to come into his apartment. So kind of the casual nature of the violence makes it seem like it's more disconnected, and it's not, and it's more cold-blooded and brutal than it would be, say, in a Hollywood film. We also see, characters getting shot multiple times, many, many times. I mean, some I feel like you get shot, they get shot maybe 5, even up to 10 rounds each. It's crazy. And I think actually with the rating system in Hollywood that you could only show characters getting shot a certain amount of times for that R rating before it would elevate to a higher rating. So whereas I guess in Hong Kong they didn't have that worry, so they could show multiple gunshots. But in the Hong Kong films, there weren't like big blood splats like squibs in the actors. They would be, they would still have the bullet hole squib, but they wouldn't be these big like blood gushing kind of squibs that say like Paul Verhoeven would use in like RoboCop. So, but what I think, elevates many of the action scenes in The Killer is, again, how emotionally charged they are, which again is another key element to Hong Kong neo-noir, because it's, because the dramatic emotions are able to transform the action to have more weight to them. Because typical action sequences are usually done for the sake of spectacle and entertainment, but because Woo infuses them with strong, emotional stakes, they have more gravitas, and weight to them. And, because the action scenes will typically begin or end on a significant emotional or thematic beat. So, for instance, the beach shootout ends with the little girl shot and John having to rescue her, as well as that scene actually starts when the little girl kind of takes a moment and has this look of concern on her face when we see that there's a sniper, a gunman in the bushes, and John takes a moment to stop, and he takes a cue from her expression, takes off his sunglasses, sees the reflection of the shooter, and then that's how the action sequence starts. And then the shootout in John's apartment begins with Sydney's betrayal of John and ends with John sparing Sydney. And then obviously the final church battle has multiple emotional climaxes, including, Sydney's death, John and Lee's kind of complete alliance, John's eventual death, and then Lee's killing of Wong. And if there's one thing that most people know about John Woo is his frequent use of slow motion. But Woo doesn't only use slow motion during action sequences. So he uses them, and he said this in the audio commentary on the DVD. He tries to use them also during important character moments as well. So he does, he did this so he could, capture the emotions of the scene better. So while they serve the action sequences well, the slow motion also serve the emotion sequences to me just as well. And then one of Woo's, also like the Doves, one of his trademark elements is the Mexican standoff. So, and if you don't know what a Mexican standoff is, it's when multiple characters are pointing guns at each other at the same time. It's usually has to include 3 or more characters, but Woo can get away with it with just 2 characters because I think the emotionality, I think that's a word, the emotional stakes of the scene are so high that I think 2 characters it works. So and we see this, and so we see this in Quentin Tarantino films like Reservoir Dogs and Inglourious Bastards, as well as some of the films of Tony Scott like True Romance and Enemy of the State. So, and in The Killer, there are a few Mexican standoffs, and they're most notably between John and Lee. So the first one, which is probably one of the most iconic images of the film, is when they first meet each other at Jenny's apartment, where Lee is waiting for John, and John opens the door, and they've got the guns pointed at each other. And then also later during the Seaside House shootout, where initially they are shooting at the guys that are trying to come in, but then they slide next to each other and they're pointing the guns at each other, which is to me is a really cool shot of the movie. And again, another very very John Woo-esque thing. So, and then The Killer also is filled with a lot of camera movements, which includes, zooms and pans and tracking shots. So, which I think is another way that he's able to keep the energy of the film and a sense of dynamism. And I think it's Woo's kinetic style and operatic action that had such a profound effect on cinema as a whole and still influences action films to this day. So The Killer is when I think Woo entered his creative and stylistic peak as a director, with his 1992 film Hard Boiled being his crowning achievement. So, I was actually introduced to Woo, to Woo from his American films first, which is unsurprising because, as a kid in the 90s, I probably wouldn't have been able to see his Hong Kong films that easily. But the first John Woo film that I ever saw was Broken Arrow with John Travolta and Christian Slater. So, and then that was followed by Face Off, which I love. And I actually think that Face Off is, John Woo's best American film, because it's his closest to his Hong Kong films. So if you watch, if you watch The Killer and then you watch Face Off, there are a lot of, maybe not a lot, but there's enough similarities there, I think, that make it seem as if John Woo Face Off has the most inherent John Woo DNA in it. And I think that's another reason why I like The Killer so much, is because it has a lot of similarities to Face Off, which is a 90s action film that I love. So, but I actually had no idea how prolific Woo was prior to his stint in Hollywood. I had no idea that he was this kind of action god director, as it were. And when I finally saw Woo's Hong Kong films, I mean, they blew me away. I mean, I had never seen action the way that Woo did it. Because Woo's American films, they weren't as violent as his Hong Kong films. So, because I'm sure, because unfortunately, I think he had to kind of rein it in a little bit. Otherwise, his films probably would have been considered, too graphic and too violent for American audiences. But his earlier films were, his earlier films, like the first two Better Tomorrows, they were really good, but they were lower budget and they didn't quite have the polish as The Killer, has. And then Hard Boiled. But I remember, when I first watched A Better Tomorrow, I was thinking to myself, man, this movie's crazy. And it was just in a way that, again, I was like, wow, it just blew my mind. And so the first thing I love about The Killer specifically is the look of it. Because I think action films are rarely praised for having a beautiful looking cinematography and a clear style to them, but The Killer truly does. And that's one of the reasons I love Tony Scott films, because his films are very visually distinctive. Even Michael Bay has a very distinct visual style to him, which I really enjoy. So, and that's something I think action films need more of, because I think the action tends to supersede more stylistic elements to film. But I think that you can make a beautiful action movie. And that's something that I really, and that's what John Woo does. He makes beautiful action movies, especially his Hong Kong films. And I'm a huge fan of that neo-noir kind of neon infused aesthetic that especially that The Killer has. So, because Hong Kong in the 80s was this vibrant and perfect city for the story. And having such strong visual choices enhances the atmosphere of the film in many ways. I just, and again, I wish that more action films, especially today, because I feel like a lot of action films today don't have a strong, visual style to them. And I'm not talking about like the hyper stylized of movies like Sin City or 300. But like one of the only films I can think of today that has, and I'm sure that there are other films, and I haven't, as many films as I've seen, I haven't seen all of them. But I think one film that comes to mind that does have a very strong visual quality to it, that I thought was a really incredible looking film, was George Miller's Mad Max Fury Road. So, very distinct, very, beautiful looking. So that was something that, again, I just wish more action films today did that. But here's the thing, even though The Killer has a very stylized look, it doesn't look unnatural or fake in a way that I think a lot of movies have become that look now. So, it's also, I think, one of the reasons films like The Killer tend to appreciate and value as they get older, because we just don't see movies that look like this anymore. So now, people can argue if films look better today than they did decades ago, but I mean, ultimately it's subjective. I think there's something to me personally that I like about older films. I think they do look better. I think films shot on film have a texture to them that modern films don't have. So I mean, there's a lot of things about newer films digitally that are great, but I tend to be more on the more old school traditional on how films look. And I'll say that there's something special when films that are able to create a distinct visual beauty without having access to the kind of technology that there is now, like digital color and the digital editing software that exists today. Wu was able to create this beautiful film in camera with the lighting and with the type of traditional film techniques that he was using. So, and what really blew me away when I first watched The Killer was just how incredible the action sequences were. So granted, and again, because his American films, which were really great films, and I think Mission Impossible 2, for instance, is where he went to got to his peak in terms of his style, I guess, in certain ways, like with the slow motion and the doves and everything. But when I watched The Killer, I think the action was just taken to a whole different level. It doesn't feel silly. It doesn't feel ridiculous. It just feels high energy and high stakes. Because every major action scene of the film plays like it's this highly dramatic symphonic movement. And because Wu utilizes slow motion so frequently, it creates more dramatic moments in the action. So, which is something that I think he does the best in his Hong Kong films, especially in The Killer. So, and some people might find his action scenes too over the top, which I can understand that, and I believe that they're that way for a reason, because it's a way to heighten the impact of the scenes. And Wu is able to make the violence brutal and beautiful at the same time. That's what's, I think, again, truly impressive. Is the way that Wu's able to design each action sequence the way he does. But what's crazy is what's even crazier is he doesn't storyboard. So Wu would envision how the shots and scenes would look in his head. So, which blows my mind. So now I think that The Killer is probably his most tragic film as well, from a story perspective, almost to kind of this Shakespearean degree, because I think The Killer has the saddest ending of any of Wu's films. Because we want to see John and Jenny end up together. And that image of them both blind, trying to crawl to each other, only to miss each other, is just, so heartbreaking. And what's really fascinating to me, though, is how Wu just didn't intend to make The Killer into an art film, but just as a mainstream blockbuster. But it was, it was Western critics that were the ones that saw the film as something more uniquely artistic than just being, a standard action film. But here's the thing. But like I said in my episode on Beauty and the Beast, I love how certain filmmakers can take a genre that is primarily known for being entertainment or just, spectacle driven, like fantasy or action or science fiction, and turn them into legitimate artistic masterpieces. So now, as far as how you can watch the film, there are a few options, although it depends on what you want. So the DVD version, this is where it kind of gets a little complicated because the DVD version from Criterion has been out of print for decades. So this version that I have, this is the original Criterion DVD version from 1998, which has been out of print since probably the early 2000s, at least maybe the mid 2000s. But if you are a completionist like me and you had to have the Criterion version, I'd say your best option is to go to eBay because that's where you find, that's where you can find the DVD version. Unfortunately, though, due to how rare they are, they aren't cheap. So, used copies will go usually for about $50 to $100. But if you want, them new, they can range from about $100. It can be $100 to $300. So, and there's a few things but people also tend to and it's one of the most bootlegged version Criterion DVDs out there. So you'll have to know the exact, I want to say the exact way that the discs look, on it. So for instance, on the top of the disc, where let's see if here I'll open it. You can kind of see it on the top of the disc. It should be just kind of a silver like face on it with this kind of cloudy white ring in the center. And then on the back of it, on that inner ring, it will say Nimbus on it. So that will mean that you have the correct DVD version if you want the Criterion version. But if you don't have to have the Criterion version, here are your other options. There was a later DVD version that came out around 2010 by the Dragon Dynasty that was part of the Dragon Dynasty collection, but that is also out of print, unfortunately. So there are no current DVD versions in print right now, but the Dragon Dynasty versions that are you can also find those on eBay, but those are much cheaper. Now, if you want the best physical version release that's currently out there, there is a 4K Blu-ray version from Shout Factory that actually just was released in December. That's available in the US, as well as a 4K release from Arrow that just came out in the UK, just I think like a week or so ago. You can also watch the film on the Criterion channel, or you can buy and rent it from streaming services like Apple TV. So I want to say thank you for joining me on the Criterion Chronicle. Once again, I hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for what's coming on the next episode. Up next on the Criterion Chronicle is Criterion Spine number 9, John Woo's epic magnum opus, Hard Boiled. So, if you want to continue on this journey with me through the Criterion Collection, then make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can follow along and not miss one of these amazing films. Take care, and I hope to see you next time.